In a Time article prompted by the movie Dante's Peak, Jeffrey Kluger describes the physics behind the eruption of a volcano. Volcanologically active areas generally lie atop clashing tectonic plates, where fractures 5 or 6 miles below the surface of the Earth create chambers into which magma rises and pools. Magma held in the chamber eventually makes its way toward the surface through channels in the overlying rock. As the ascending ooze climbs higher, the pressure on it dramatically reduces, allowing gases trapped within to bubble out like carbonation in an open bottle of soda. As this happens, the magma takes on a foamier consistency, increasing its speed and mobility. When this scalding froth rises high enough to make contact with subterranean water, the water flashes into steam, turning the whole hellish mix into a natural pressure cooker. Finally, the explosively pressurized magma blasts out of the earth in an eruption that can send rock, ashes, and gases flying out at near supersonic speeds. The first debris disgorged by a volcano is often a great gray mass of ash. The opaque cloud made of pulverized rock and glass falls like concrete snow on land and buildings miles away and may blot out the sun for days. After the ash, volcanoes produce sometimes what is called a pyroclastic flow, a ground-hugging cloud of superheated gas and rock that forces a cushion of air down the mountainside at up to 100 miles per hour, incinerating everything in its path. Other mountains spew that signature substance of the volcano, lava. For decades, Mount St. Helens in Washington was a disaster waiting to happen, with a great chamber of molten magma cooking beneath it. In 1980, Mount St. Helens exploded, killing 60 people. Kluger writes that Mount Rainier has a similar profile, with a huge chamber of magma boiling beneath it, and with little towns like Ording, Washington, in its shadow. According to government geologists, the question is not whether Mount Rainier will blow, but when it will blow. And will people be ready? And the same is true about God's wrath. Certainly right now we live in a window of mercy, but do not let the relative calm deceive you. God's wrath is going to come on the earth, and it's going to come suddenly. Today we're going to take a look at God's wrath in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 23. In verses 18 through 20, we will see the wrath of God revealed, and in verses 21 through 23, we will see the wisdom of God rejected. Let's take a look at the passage. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, animals, and creeping things. Now, we're going to start with verses 18 and 20, and here we see the wrath of God revealed. And what's surprising about this is that in the verses just preceding this, verses 16 and 17, we see the gospel. For instance, in verse 16, we see the power of God to save men and women revealed in verse 16. And in verse 17, we see that God provides a righteousness of his own to men and women who put their trust in Christ. But in verse 18, we see the wrath of God revealed. And the question really is why the gospel and the wrath of God are juxtaposed in this way, why they're right together. Why are they so closely intertwined? And as we'll see as we go through verses 18 through 20, we'll see why Paul has juxtaposed these two together. So let's take a look at verse 18, because in verse 18 we see that God's wrath is because of the ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Take a look at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. We see what is revealed in verse 18. Paul says that the wrath of God is revealed. The wrath of God is his personal anger against sin. God's anger is not selfish or arbitrary as man's anger often is, but it represents his holy and loving response to human wickedness. We see who God's wrath is directed against in the second part of verse 18. God's wrath is directed at specific human beings who are ungodly and unrighteous. Now, ungodly behavior is actions against God. Speech that slanders God's goodness, or a failure an unwillingness to recognize who God is and what he has done. Unrighteousness, on the other hand, is actions taken against human beings. Envy, covetousness, gossip, abuse, even murder would be some of the actions that human beings might be guilty of perpetrating against other human beings. Beginning with the phrase, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth, and going through verse 20, we see why God's wrath is directed toward these particular men and women. You see, men and women who have turned away from God and have given themselves over to selfish pursuits often want to convince others that there is no God. They suppress the truth about God. Because they have rejected the truth about God themselves, they often want to lead others to believe that there is no God as well. And now we can see why the gospel in verses 16 and 17 and the wrath of God are tied together. Because we know from verses 16 and 17 that God sent his world God sent his Son into the world to die for men and women because he loved them. He wanted to save them. Because he has revealed himself so plainly, they should know him. But if men and women who have rejected this salvation have suppressed the truth about God, then God is going to feel anger toward those people, because God loves the people to whom they're suppressing the truth. He wants them to be saved, and he's angry with them because they're suppressing the truth so others may not know him. Now in verse 19, we see that wrath is because they should know him. Take a look at verse 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Though God is a spirit and invisible to human eyes, he has revealed himself plainly to men and women. Because he has revealed himself so plainly, they should know him, but instead they have rejected what they know to be true. Even though God has gone out of his way to reveal himself to them, they have rejected what they know and have even turned around and suppressed the truth so that others may not know him as well. Now take a look at verse 20, because in verse 20 we see that there is God's wrath on them because they have no excuse. Take a look. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. We see how God has revealed himself to mankind, though we can't see him. He has revealed his eternal power and divine nature in the creation he has made. If you have ever stood next to a waterfall and watched a river pour over the abyss, into the abyss, you can understand something of the power of God. I can remember going to Yellowstone National Park one time and standing on a platform just above the Yellowstone River as it plunged over the cliff. And I remember thinking to myself what it would be like to be swimming in the Yellowstone River and to go over the falls and just be pulverized in the bottom. And I got just a glimpse of the power of God. Or if you've ever seen a tornado or a hurricane and the power that they have to destroy things, you have some idea of the power of God. Because God created these things, he obviously has more power than they do. He's just loaned them some of his power. If you've ever wondered at the intricacy of the human body or the complexity of weather systems, if you've ever watched God paint the sky with colors at a sunset or a sunrise, you have some idea of the wisdom and creativity of God. You have seen a shadow of God's divine nature. If you've ever heard of a hero who sacrificed himself or herself for the life of another, you have just witnessed a shadow of God's goodness. Or if you've ever watched with satisfaction a movie in which justice is done for someone who is wronged, you have caught a glimpse of God's justice. God has plainly revealed himself in creation, including mankind. While this knowledge is not enough to save us, it clearly reveals the kind of God who has created all things. And to reject this knowledge and then to suppress that knowledge is enough to condemn those who reject it. Let me summarize. God is angry with those who have rejected the truth and then have suppressed the truth so others cannot know God and come to love him. Now in verses 21 through 23, we'll see the wisdom of God rejected. Paul says that the wrath of God is revealed in the present tense. Anyone who has read the Bible knows that there is a day of judgment coming, often called the day of the Lord, where all who have rejected Christ will experience God's wrath. But that is in the future. So the question is, why is the wrath of God revealed in this passage as being in the present tense? And the answer to that question is discovered in verses 21 through 23. So let's take a look at verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And here we see how God's wrath is present in the present. Because Paul says that they knew the truth about God, but they didn't worship him. They did not honor him or give thanks to him for all that he had done to reveal himself to them, and instead they rejected that truth. And because they rejected that truth, God gave them over to futile thinking. Now that means that their thinking was incapable of producing any useful result. Their thinking was useless. Now that doesn't mean that in the present time they couldn't make money or create beautiful works of art or write books that were interesting and useful, but in terms of eternal things, their thinking was useless. And ultimately, in light of eternity, if you don't think eternally, what you're thinking is short-term and useless. And while they might want to be remembered in history, their lives would be lived apart from God and his love and purpose for their lives, for which God has created them. Not knowing God made their hearts foolish, and the further they wandered from the light of God's love, the darker their hearts became. Now in verse 22, we see that they claimed to be wise, but they actually became fools. Take a look. Verse 22 is very short. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. You can see this clearly in American politics. One of the brilliant concepts enshrined in the Constitution is that men have a bent toward doing bad things, and consequently human beings cannot be trusted on their own, not to be corrupted by power, and so there must be accountability at every level of government. And that is why the president's power is limited by the judicial branch and the legislative branch. The legislative branch's power is limited by the executive branch and the judicial branch. At every level of government, the founding fathers incorporated accountability so that men could not be corrupted by the power. You see, the founding fathers knew that unlimited power corrupted even good people, and so they built in accountability. The founding fathers were wise because they built a government that was based on biblical truth, on scriptural truth. The opposite is true of socialism. At the root of socialism is the idea that humans are basically good and even perfectible given the right circumstances. So there doesn't need to be accountability because humans, properly educated and surrounded by a good culture, will automatically do what is right. But every time socialism has been tried, and it's been tried a number of times, it's failed. Why? Because it is based upon a false principle. They claim to be wise. They claim to know human psychology and human nature, but the truth is, it is not biblical truth, and so they have proven themselves to be foolish. And this is true for us too. If we build lives on biblical truth, we will turn out to be wise people. But if we build our lives on worldly principles that are not biblical, we will become fools. Now in verse 23, we see that they refused to worship God and instead worshiped creation. Take a look. And exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Because they refused to worship God, they turned instead to the worship of created things. Why? Because human beings are limited in their wisdom and in their power and in their resources. And so they turn to other things for help in their weakness. And in turning to other things, they began to serve those things. When Paul wrote, people actually worshiped false gods that were represented by idols. And while not many worship idols today, everyone today still serves something. They might serve power, or they might serve fame or money or the environment or education. But if they serve anything other than God, who created them to worship him and obey him, they have created an idol. This is the ultimate foolishness, for nothing can take the place of God in our hearts. Let me summarize. The wrath of God is poured out on those who reject the truth and suppress it by giving them up to futile thinking, darkened hearts, and foolishness. There is a poem called Richard Cory, written by Edward Arlington, that illustrates the foolishness of rejecting God's love and grace. Let me share the poem with you. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean-favored, imperially slim. He was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pulses when he said, "Good morning," and he glittered when he walked. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he was everything to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without meat and cursed the bread, and Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet in his head. You see, a life without God's love and light is not only foolish, but it is pointless and painful. And ultimately, such a life lived without the knowledge of God, lived without the truth of God, lived without the love of God, will face the wrath of God.